The wind rolled over the wide plains, carrying dust and whispers with it. Folks in town said that the West was built on two things: pride and survival. Pride could lift a man high, but it could also break him down. Survival was for everyone, rich or poor, strong or weak. And it was in this land of endless skies and unforgiving soil that a story began, one people would tell for years to come. The story of a wealthy rancher, a struggling widow, and the test that nearly cost them both their peace. The rancher's name was Samuel Hardin. Folks knew him as one of the richest landowners in the county. He had more cattle than some men had coins in their pockets, and more acres than he could ride across in a week. His barn stood strong, his fences ran straight, and his word carried weight. But Samuel wasn't the kind of man who boasted. He was quiet, steady, and watched the world with the eyes of someone who knew that money could build fences but not always trust. Trust to Samuel was worth more than gold. And in a world where men schemed and women whispered, he held it close to his chest like a gun he wouldn't hand over to just anyone. That was why, when the poor widow came into his life, he felt both drawn and uncertain. Her name was Clara. She had lost her husband to a fever 2 winters past, and since then, life had been little more than a series of battles she never asked to fight. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both too young to carry a man's weight but old enough to feel the hunger in their bellies when food ran thin. Clara worked wherever she could, sewing for neighbors, taking in laundry, cooking for church gatherings. She wasn't the kind of woman to beg, and that was what made folks notice her. She carried herself with dignity, even when her shoes wore thin and her hands cracked from soap and cold water. Some admired her. Others envied the quiet strength she carried. But everyone whispered the same thing: the widow was proud, maybe too proud. Samuel noticed her first at a town gathering. It wasn't her beauty that caught him, though she had a softness about her that even grief hadn't taken away. It was the way she stood apart, not asking for a thing, not trying to draw attention, just watching her children eat with grateful eyes when others shared food. That night, he went home thinking of her, and for weeks after, her face stayed in his mind like the sound of a tune you couldn't forget. But Samuel had been burned before. Rich men in those days attracted more than admiration. They attracted schemes, lies, and false kindness. He had seen women smile at him not for who he was, but for the weight of his wallet. And though Samuel had a strong heart, he had built walls around it. He told himself that trust was the one thing he would never hand over lightly. So when the thought of Clara began to settle in him like roots in the ground, he wrestled with it. Was she truly the woman people whispered her to be? Or was there a hunger in her that went beyond survival, a hunger for the security his money could provide? It was a restless question, one he couldn't shake. And so, in a decision that would one day haunt him with both shame and gratitude, Samuel made a plan. He would test her. It wasn't noble, maybe not even fair, but in his heart he needed to know. He would find out what kind of woman Clara really was, not through words but through what she did when she thought no one was watching. The chance came on a cool evening when Clara had been hired to help clean and prepare food at Samuel's ranch. He had invited neighbors for a gathering, and she had been one of the women to lend a hand. The night was long, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted meat. When the last guest had gone, Clara stayed behind to tidy the kitchen. Samuel, who had been watching her more than he cared to admit, decided the moment had come. He told her he was tired and would rest on the long couch in the front room. He stretched out, covered himself lightly with a blanket, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, steady and deep, and before long, Clara thought he had fallen asleep. What she did next was the truth Samuel thought he wanted, but it would nearly stop his heart. At first, Clara simply continued cleaning. She moved softly, her steps careful not to wake him. She gathered plates, wiped the table, and stacked what needed washing. Samuel, under the veil of false sleep, listened to every sound, every motion. He waited for the moment she might slip, take a coin from the counter, open a drawer she had no business opening, or perhaps look at him in a way that revealed hidden thoughts. But she did none of that. She moved like a woman who knew the weight of other people's homes, careful and respectful. And for a moment, Samuel's heart eased. But then, when the room was quiet, Clara walked closer. Samuel felt her presence near him, felt the air shift as she stood above his resting form. His heart tightened. This was the moment. He kept still, barely breathing though his mind raced. Then, with a softness that startled him, Clara reached down. She didn't touch his wallet, which sat in plain sight on the table. She didn't reach for the gold watch that gleamed faintly by the lamplight. Instead, her fingers pulled the blanket higher over his chest, tucking it in around his shoulders as though he were the tired one in need of care. She stood for a moment, watching him with a face full of something he couldn't name, Was it pity, kindness, or perhaps even love? Then, almost as if she caught herself, she stepped back quickly, turned, and went about her work again. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He had expected greed, or at least curiosity. What he found was tenderness, so simple and honest it made him feel ashamed for ever doubting her. For the first time in years, the walls around his heart cracked. And as he lay there, pretending to sleep, he realized the test he had set was not a test of Clara's character at all. It was a test of his own. And in that moment, Samuel Hardin, the wealthy rancher with land enough to break a man's back, froze in place, humbled by the quiet dignity of a poor widow who had given him nothing but honesty. But the story did not end there. Because out on the plains, truth has a way of stirring trouble, and the smallest whispers can grow into storms. Samuel would have to reckon with what he saw that night, and Clara would face the weight of a world that did not forgive a woman's pride so easily. What began as a simple test would soon ripple into a tale of justice, love, and the kind of dignity no amount of gold could buy. The days after that night weighed heavy on Samuel's mind. He had seen Clara's heart in a way no one else had. The memory of her gentle hand pulling the blanket over him stayed with him more than her words ever could. But with that memory came shame. He had set a trap for her, hoping to prove her weak, greedy, or false, and instead he found himself staring at his own mistrust. A rich man testing a poor widow, it was the kind of thing that showed more about him than her, and he knew it. Still, he could not bring himself to speak of it. Pride is a stubborn thing, and Samuel carried it as steady as his ranch walls. He watched Clara from a distance when she came to work again, sweeping his barns or scrubbing floors with her children waiting nearby. She never asked him for anything more than what was owed. No favors, no soft words, no hints. Just honest labor and the dignity of earning her bread. The town, however, was less kind. Whispers traveled faster than the river in spring. Some men in the saloon muttered that Samuel was a fool for letting a widow work in his house. They said women like her always had an eye on the man who signed the pay. Others claimed Clara's pride made her dangerous, that she thought herself better than the pity of others. The wives in town, many of them struggling too, looked at her with mixed feelings, some with pity, others with coldness. It was easier to believe a woman must have hidden intentions than to admit she was surviving without bending. Clara bore it all in silence. Her children, Matthew and Sarah, were the reason she rose each morning, even when her body cried for rest. Matthew, at 11, tried to take on a man's work, hauling water or chopping kindling for neighbors, but Samuel could see the boy's shoulders were too narrow yet. Sarah, younger, clung to her mother's skirts but carried a spark in her eyes, the kind that reminded Samuel of wildflowers that grew even in dry soil. One evening, after a long day, Samuel offered Clara a ride home in his wagon. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the fields. She hesitated at first, too proud to accept, but with her children tired, she finally agreed. The ride was quiet, save for the creak of wheels and the call of distant coyotes. After some time, Samuel spoke. "You've been working hard here," he said, his voice steady. "More than most could manage." Clara glanced at him, her face lit faintly by the fading light. "Work is all I have left to give, Mr. Hardin. It keeps the children fed. It keeps me standing." Her words struck him like a hammer. No begging, no flattery, just truth. He nodded but said nothing more, though inside he wanted to tell her what he had seen that night, how it had changed the way he looked at her. But he held his tongue. As weeks passed, Samuel's respect for Clara deepened. Yet the test he had set, the shame of it, gnawed at him. Could a man like him, rich and guarded, ever deserve the trust of a woman like her, who had carried herself through storms without asking for rescue? Trouble found them sooner than expected. A man named Crawford, tall, broad, and bitter, ran cattle on the edge of Samuel's land. He had long resented Samuel's wealth, and when Clara began working at the Hardin ranch, Crawford found new fuel for his spite. He spread whispers that the widow was trapping Samuel, that she would marry him and bleed his fortune dry. In the saloon, his words spread like wildfire. In church, they turned into sideways glances. One Sunday morning, Clara walked her children to the small wooden church. She held her head high, though she felt the weight of eyes on her. After the service, a woman brushed past her and muttered, "Shameful, latching onto another man so soon." Clara's face burned, but she did not reply. She only tightened her grip on Sarah's hand and walked away. That evening, when Samuel heard of the whispers, anger rose in him. He rode hard to town, tied his horse outside the saloon, and pushed through the swinging doors. The place went quiet when he stepped in. Samuel wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but his eyes that night burned hotter than the lanterns on the wall. "Crawford," he said, his voice sharp as a whip. You've had your fun with words. Say one more against that woman and you'll answer to me. The room held its breath. Crawford sneered, but even he knew Samuel's reputation. He muttered something low and turned back to his drink. Samuel left without another word, but the message was clear. Still, the damage had been done. When Clara heard what Samuel had done, she was torn. Gratitude filled her heart, but so did fear. A widow depending on the defense of a rich rancher was fuel for more gossip. She tried to thank him, but he only shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said. "You've done nothing wrong. Folks forget what it means to carry yourself with dignity. Let them whisper. They'll grow tired soon enough." But they didn't grow tired. The whispers dug deeper, the judgment harsher. One afternoon, as Clara worked in the ranch kitchen, Samuel finally spoke the truth he had kept hidden. "Clara," he said slowly, "there's something I must tell you. The night you worked here after the gathering, I wasn't asleep. I pretended. I wanted to see if you'd take advantage, if you'd reach for what wasn't yours. Instead, you covered me like a fool child. I have thought of it every day since, and I cannot rest until you know the truth." Clara froze, the rag in her hand trembling. Her face flushed, not with shame, but with hurt. "You tested me?" she whispered. Samuel's chest tightened. "I did. And I was wrong. It was pride and fear and mistrust. I see that now. But what I saw in you that night humbled me. I have not been able to forget it." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then she set the rag down and looked at him with eyes that had weathered storms. "Mr. Hardin, I am poor, yes. I have known hunger, yes. But I would sooner starve with dignity than steal from any man. Your test," her voice caught, then steadied, "your test was not for me. It was for yourself. And now you know." Her words cut deep, but they carried no malice. They carried truth. Samuel bowed his head, ashamed. "You're right," he said softly. "I will not ask your forgiveness, but I will carry the weight of my mistake." What neither of them knew then was that this confession would soon change everything, not just for them but for the whole town. Because word has a way of finding ears, and when pride and truth collide, the story rarely stays quiet. The poor widow had been tested, the rich rancher humbled. But the real trial was yet to come, one that would ask not what Clara would do for survival, but what both of them would do for justice, dignity, and the love neither had dared to name. The weeks that followed Samuel's confession to Clara felt like walking on the edge of a blade. Between them, silence grew, not of anger but of weight. Samuel had admitted his shame, and Clara had spoken her truth, but neither knew how to step forward from it. Their lives brushed close, her work on the ranch, his quiet glances, but there was a distance that neither pride nor honesty could bridge. The town, meanwhile, had not grown quieter. Crawford, bitter and restless, took Samuel's warning as an insult too deep to ignore. He began spreading darker tales. He told men in the saloon that Samuel had already promised the widow land, money, and marriage, that she had bewitched him with soft eyes and clever hands. Every time Clara passed through town with her children, whispers trailed behind her like dust after a wagon. Sarah, too young to understand, would ask, "Mama, why do they stare?" Clara would only smile faintly and say, "Because people often watch what they do not understand." Samuel tried to shield her from it, but even he could not stop the tide. And in a town where pride mattered more than truth, rumor became law. One evening, as Samuel rode back from checking fences, he spotted Clara walking the dirt road with Matthew and Sarah. They carried small bundles of food from a church gathering. The sky above was painted in streaks of pink and gold. Samuel reined his horse beside them. "Evening," he said softly, tipping his hat. Clara nodded, her children smiling faintly, though tired. Samuel hesitated, then offered, "Ride with me. I'll take you home." Clara's lips pressed together. Pride wrestled with practicality. Finally, for the sake of her children's weary feet, she agreed. Samuel helped them into the wagon, and for a stretch, silence filled the air. Then Matthew, bold with the innocence of youth, looked at Samuel and asked, "Mr. Hardin, why do folks talk bad about Mama?" The question cut through the air sharper than any knife. Clara stiffened, her face pale. She opened her mouth to hush him, but Samuel spoke first, his voice firm. "Because some folks don't know the truth, Matthew. And when they don't know, they make up stories. But a man or woman's worth isn't in the words others say, it's in the life they live." Matthew's eyes lingered on him with the trust of a boy who longed for a father's steadiness. Clara, though grateful, looked away, her heart torn between anger at the town and gratitude for Samuel's words. That night, when Samuel returned home, he sat long in his chair, staring into the dark. He realized something he had been too stubborn to admit before. Clara had given him more than just humility that night when she covered him with a blanket. She had given him a glimpse of a life beyond wealth, beyond mistrust. A life built on care, honesty, and dignity. And Samuel, for all his riches, realized how poor he was without it. But before he could act on that truth, trouble came riding. Crawford, in his bitterness, wasn't content with whispers anymore. One late afternoon, while Clara hung laundry outside her small cabin, she noticed dust rising from the road. Crawford rode up with 2 other men, his eyes dark, his mouth twisted with spite. Clara stood her ground, her children clinging to her skirts. "Evening, widow," Crawford called, his tone dripping mockery. "Heard you've been keeping fine company up at the Hardin Ranch. Must be nice, letting a rich man fill your pantry." Clara's face burned, but she held steady. "I work for my bread, Crawford. Always have, always will." Crawford laughed, a cruel sound. "Work? Folks say different. Folks say you're laying snares for Samuel Hardin. You've got him wrapped like a calf in rope. Don't deny it." Matthew stepped forward, fists clenched, but Clara pulled him back. Her voice, though trembling, rang clear. "Get off my land." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "Careful, widow. Words like that can make life hard out here. A woman alone shouldn't forget her place." Before Clara could answer, hoofbeats thundered down the road. Samuel, riding hard, appeared, his horse lathered with sweat. He pulled up between Crawford and Clara's cabin, his eyes blazing. "That's enough," Samuel barked. "Crawford, you so much as breathe another word against her, you'll wish you'd never crossed me." Crawford sneered but backed his horse. "Careful, Hardin. You think you're defending her honor, but she'll cost you more than you know." With that, he wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. Clara's shoulders shook, though she fought to hide it. Samuel turned to her, his face softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded faintly, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "This is what comes of people's tongues," she whispered. "They'll destroy me. They'll destroy my children." Samuel dismounted, stepping close. "Not if I stand with you." Her gaze lifted to his, searching, uncertain. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And though neither spoke the word, something unspoken passed between them. Something deeper than pride, stronger than rumor. In the days that followed, Samuel did not hide his respect for Clara. He rode with her to town, worked beside her in the fields when she was short on hands, and made it plain before all that she had his trust. The town buzzed louder than ever, but Samuel stood firm. And Clara, though torn between fear and gratitude, began to see in him not just a rancher, not just a protector, but a man willing to risk his own pride for her dignity. But Crawford was not done. Pride and jealousy are poisons that don't wash clean with a single warning. In the weeks ahead, his anger would grow into something darker, and the line between rumor and violence would blur. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would test not only Samuel and Clara, but the whole community's sense of justice and truth. For in the Wild West, justice was often written not in courts or papers, but in the choices of men when they stood face to face with right and wrong. And soon, Samuel Hardin and Clara, the widow, would find themselves at the center of that trial. Crawford's pride was like dry brush under a hot sun. One spark and it burned out of control. Samuel's warning might have silenced him for a few days, but resentment festered in the dark corners of his mind. The more he thought about the rich rancher defending a poor widow, the more it gnawed at him. To Crawford, it wasn't just about Clara. It was about being overshadowed by a man he already envied. Every whisper in town about Samuel and the widow felt like an insult aimed at him. And Crawford wasn't the kind of man to let insults lie. The town of Dry Creek had always been small enough that everyone's business felt like everyone else's. A man's reputation was his armor, and a woman's dignity was her shelter. It didn't take much to crack either. Crawford knew this, and he set about using it like a weapon. In the saloon, he told stories of how he'd seen Clara sneaking into Samuel's house late at night. At the feed store, he hinted that Samuel's sudden kindness toward her children was more than charity. By the time Sunday came around, half the congregation looked at Clara not with pity or kindness, but with suspicion. Clara felt it keenly. She kept her chin high, but inside the weight grew heavier each day. Her children noticed it too. Matthew grew sharper, quicker to anger. Sarah clung tighter to her hand, asking more questions about why people whispered. At night, when the house was quiet, Clara prayed for strength. Not for wealth, not for escape, just strength to endure with dignity. Samuel, meanwhile, saw the storm rising and knew he couldn't stand idle. One evening, he rode to Clara's cabin as the last light faded. She was sitting on the porch, her sewing basket beside her, though the needle had slipped idle in her lap. The children were already inside, their voices faint through the thin walls. "Clara," Samuel said gently, stepping down from his horse. She looked up, her face weary but steady. "Evening, Mr. Harden." He hesitated, then sat on the step beside her, his hat in his hands. For a long moment, they listened to the crickets and the rustle of wind through the grass. Then Samuel spoke. "I know what Crawford's been saying. I know the town's turned cold. But I won't let it stand. Not for you. Not for the children." Clara's eyes flickered with both gratitude and fear. "And what will you do, Samuel? Fight every whisper? Challenge every man? They'll only talk louder. They'll say I've trapped you. And maybe in their eyes that's true. A widow working on a rich man's ranch, it was always going to raise tongues." Samuel turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Let them talk. Truth doesn't bend to rumor. I saw who you are, Clara. I saw it the night you covered me with a blanket instead of reaching for my wallet. I tested you, and in doing so, I tested myself. And I'll tell you plain, I'd rather stand beside you in the face of their lies than sit alone in the comfort of their approval." Her breath caught, and for the first time she let her eyes linger on him. Not as an employer, not as a rancher, but as a man. There was a warmth there, a steadiness she hadn't let herself hope for since her husband died. But still, fear shadowed her voice. "Samuel, if you stand with me you'll pay a price. Men like Crawford won't forgive it. The town may not either." He gave a small, sad smile. "Then let them. A man with all the land and cattle in the world is still poor if he's too afraid to stand for what's right." Clara's eyes shimmered, though she blinked the tears back. "You're a stubborn man, Samuel Harden. And you," he said softly, "are stronger than any woman I've ever known." The air between them held something unspoken, something fragile but undeniable. Neither moved closer, but both knew the line between them had changed. But as Samuel had warned, standing together came with a price. The very next week, Crawford made his move. He showed up at the church, not drunk but sharp-eyed and loud. As the congregation gathered after service, he raised his voice so all could hear. "Tell me, folks," he shouted, his eyes sweeping the crowd, "is this the kind of town we are now? Where a widow can twist her way into a rich man's house and fortune, and we all just nod like fools?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara stiffened, her children clutching her hands. Samuel stepped forward, his jaw set. "Crawford, that's enough," he warned. But Crawford wasn't done. Or maybe Harden's the fool. Maybe he can't see she's playing him like a fiddle. Poor helpless widow, what a fine story. But we all know what she's after. She wants his land, his money, his name. And he's too blind to see it. The crowd gasped, some murmuring agreement, others shaking their heads. Clara's face burned with humiliation, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but her throat locked tight. Samuel's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Crawford, you've had your say. Now hear mine. Clara has worked harder than any man I know, carrying her children on her back without asking a thing from anyone. If you think she's after my money, you're a fool. And if any of you believe his lies, you'd better take a long look at the life she's lived before you cast stones." The churchyard fell silent. Samuel's words hung heavy in the air. Crawford sneered, but for once he had no reply. He turned on his heel and stormed off, muttering curses. The crowd, however, was split. Some bowed their heads in shame, realizing they had judged unfairly. Others whispered still, clinging to doubt. Clara, though shaken, stood straighter than before. For the first time she wasn't alone in facing the storm. That night, as Samuel rode home, he knew the battle was far from over. Crawford wasn't a man to lick his wounds quietly. He would strike again, harder, and next time words might not be his only weapon. And Samuel, staring out across the dark plains, made himself a silent vow. Whatever came, he would not let Clara face it alone. The days ahead would prove that vow true, for the storm Crawford carried in his heart was about to break wide across the town, and no one, not Samuel, not Clara, not even the children, would be left untouched. The Sunday showdown in the churchyard had left the town of Dry Creek buzzing like a hornet's nest. Folks carried the words home with them, turning them over like stones in their minds. Some said Samuel Harden was a fool, blind to the widow's ways. Others, quieter but firm, said Crawford was the one who showed his colors that day. But no matter which side they leaned toward, one truth settled deep into the town's bones: this matter wasn't over. Crawford had left in a fury, and everyone knew a man like him didn't take humiliation lightly. Clara tried to keep life steady for her children. She rose early, worked her hands raw, and tucked them into bed with a calm voice even when her own spirit was trembling. But at night, when the house grew still and the wind carried coyote howls through the dark, she would sit at the window staring out across the empty road. She knew Crawford's kind of pride. It wasn't satisfied until it drew blood. Samuel, meanwhile, doubled his watch over the ranch. He rode the fences himself, checked the barns, and kept a rifle closer than before. His men noticed the change, but none dared ask. Samuel wasn't a man who spoke of worry, but his silence carried its own warning. And when he passed through town, the glances followed him as much as Clara now. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in fire, Samuel rode out toward Clara's cabin. He found her stacking wood while Matthew hauled kindling and Sarah chased chickens back toward their coop. He dismounted and walked up, his hat pulled low against the wind. "You shouldn't be out here without a proper guard," he said quietly. Clara straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "I've been out here alone for years, Samuel. If I needed a guard for every whisper or threat, I'd never have lasted this long." Samuel's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. "This is different. Crawford isn't just whispering anymore. I've seen men like him. They stir trouble until it burns out of their control." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "I know. But I can't run from it. My children need to see me stand, not hide." Samuel felt a swell of respect but also worry. He wanted to tell her to pack up, move to his ranch, let him shield her from the storm. But he knew better than to wound her pride that way. So instead he only said, "Then let me stand with you. You've carried enough alone." Clara's eyes shimmered, though she blinked the tears back. "You already have, Samuel. More than you know." That night, Samuel lingered long enough to share supper with them. Simple bread, beans, and coffee. It wasn't the meal that mattered, but the quiet warmth around the table. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to breathe easy in his company, and the children laughed more freely with him there. Samuel left only when the stars filled the sky, but the memory of that small, humble supper stayed with him like a lantern in the dark. But Crawford was watching. 2 nights later the trouble came. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, and rushed to the window. Flames licked at the small shed behind the cabin, the one where she stored wood for winter. Matthew stirred, rubbing his eyes, and Sarah whimpered in her bed. Clara pulled them close, her voice steady despite the terror clawing her chest. "Stay here. Don't move," she told them. She ran outside barefoot, the night air sharp against her skin. The shed was already half consumed, the dry wood feeding the fire like a hungry beast. Clara grabbed a bucket, pumped water from the well, and threw it at the flames. It hissed uselessly. She pumped again, her arms trembling, her breath ragged, but the fire only grew. Then she heard it, the sound of horses fading into the distance. She froze, the bucket slipping from her hands. Whoever had lit the fire was already gone. By the time neighbors came running, the shed was gone, and Clara stood in the glow of embers, her children clinging to her skirts. She didn't speak a word, but in her heart she knew who had done it. When Samuel arrived the next morning, his face was carved in stone. He listened to what little Clara told, then walked to the blackened remains of the shed. He crouched, touched the charred wood, and stared at the tracks leading away. His jaw tightened. "It was Crawford," he said flatly. Clara put a hand to his arm. "Samuel?" But he shook his head, rising to his full height. "He came to frighten you. Next time he'll come for more. I won't let that happen." The fire became the talk of the town by noon. Some muttered that it served the widow right for stirring trouble. Others shook their heads at the cruelty of it. But few dared speak Crawford's name aloud. He was a bully, yes, but a dangerous one, and fear made men swallow their tongues. Samuel wasn't one of them. That evening he rode straight into town, stopping his horse outside the saloon. The doors swung open under his hand and he stepped inside, his spurs sharp on the wooden floor. The room fell silent. Crawford sat at a corner table, a grin curling at his lips when he saw Samuel. "Evening, Hardin," Crawford drawled. "Heard the widow had some bad luck last night. Shame, isn't it?" Samuel's voice was low, dangerous. "You lit that fire." Crawford spread his hands innocently. "Now why would I do that? I was right here in town all night." A few men chuckled nervously, but Samuel didn't waver. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Crawford. "Listen well. If you ever go near her land again, if you so much as ride past her fence, I'll put an end to it myself. You think you're feared, Crawford? You don't know fear until you stand against me." The room was still. Crawford's smirk faltered, but he forced a laugh. "Careful, Hardin. Threats like that can get a man in trouble." Samuel leaned down, his voice a whisper only Crawford could hear. "The trouble's already here. Pray you don't see it worse." With that, he straightened and walked out, leaving the saloon in stunned silence. But Crawford's pride, once wounded, refused to heal. He began gathering men who shared his bitterness, drifters, drunkards, and those who envied Samuel's wealth. Whispers of a plan stirred in the shadows. And though Samuel tightened his guard, he knew a storm was gathering, one that no fence or rifle could fully hold back. Clara felt it too. Each day she worked, each night she tucked her children in, she could sense the dangers circling like wolves. But alongside that fear, something else grew. In Samuel's steady presence, in his fierce defense, she found not just protection but a kind of strength she hadn't felt since her husband died. A strength that whispered of something more, something she dared not name but could no longer deny. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would not just decide her fate or Samuel's, but the very soul of Dry Creek. The nights grew sharper as autumn pressed against Dry Creek. The fire that destroyed Clara's shed seemed only a warning of what lingered in the shadows. Samuel knew Crawford wouldn't stop. A man with a bruised pride and empty soul always struck harder the second time. One evening, Samuel stood on the ridge above his ranch, the wind tugging at his coat. He looked across the valley where Clara's cabin sat faint in the twilight. A lantern glowed faintly in her window, steady as a heartbeat. He thought of her, how she stood in church without trembling, how she fought the fire with her bare hands, how she never asked for pity. She had lived on less and still carried herself with dignity. And Samuel, for all his wealth, knew he had never seen such richness. But he also knew Crawford was gathering men. Word traveled fast in small towns, carried in whispers through saloons and along fence lines. Crawford had promised to teach the widow and her friend Hardin a lesson. It wasn't a threat Samuel could shrug aside. So he prepared. He kept his rifles loaded, doubled the night patrol on his ranch and made sure his men were steady. But more than that, he watched Clara. Often, he'd ride out under the pretense of checking the land, but truth was, he just needed to see her safe. Clara, though grateful, grew restless under the tension. One night after supper, while Matthew and Sarah slept, she sat with Samuel by the fire. The crackle of wood filled the silence until she spoke. "Samuel," she began softly, "I can't live with fear pressing against my door. My children can't. If Crawford wants to ruin me, he'll find a way. Maybe it would be better if—" her voice faltered. "If I left Dry Creek." Samuel turned sharply, his voice firm but gentle. "Don't you say that. You fought too hard, Clara. This is your home. This land is yours, bought with sweat and sorrow. Leaving would hand him the victory he wants." She lowered her eyes. "But I'm tired. Tired of fighting shadows." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes burning with quiet fire. "Then let me fight them with you. You've carried this burden long enough. Let me carry the weight now." Her gaze lifted to his, and for a heartbeat, the air between them felt heavy with something unspoken. She saw in him not just a protector, but a man who had chosen her dignity over his own pride, who saw her not as a burden but as a partner in strength. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Before she could speak, a sound broke the stillness, the distant thunder of hooves. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, pulling his rifle from the wall. He motioned her to stay behind as he stepped outside. The moon lit the valley, and there in the distance, a group of riders moved like shadows across the land. "They're coming," Samuel muttered. Clara's heart clenched. "Crawford." "There's no mistaking it," Samuel said. His voice was steady but his jaw was tight. "He's brought men. And he's brought trouble." The riders didn't storm the cabin that night, but they circled, hollering curses into the dark, firing shots into the air. They meant to scare her, to rattle Samuel, to show power without striking. But both Samuel and Clara knew, it was only the beginning. The next days were uneasy. Dry Creek buzzed with gossip. Some townsfolk shook their heads at Crawford's antics, while others muttered that Samuel was inviting ruin by protecting the widow. Fear made some avoid Clara in the street, as though her courage was a contagion they dared not catch. But Clara held her head high, even as whispers stung her ears. It was on the third night that Crawford finally struck. The attack came after midnight. Clara woke to the sound of shattering glass. Flames erupted at the corner of her cabin. This time not the shed but her very home. She grabbed Matthew and Sarah, pulling them from their beds, her heart pounding as the fire spread across the wooden wall. Then came the pounding of hooves, the cruel laughter outside. Shadows of men moved against the fire's glow. Clara clutched her children, whispering frantic prayers. Before the flames swallowed the cabin, Samuel appeared. He had been watching from his ranch, sensing the strike. He burst through the door, rifle in hand, his voice cutting through the smoke. "Get the children out," he barked. Clara didn't question. She pushed Matthew and Sarah toward the door, her own lungs burning. Samuel covered them, firing into the night, driving back the shadows. Bullets answered, striking the walls, shattering what little safety the cabin had left. Neighbors, stirred by the noise, began to gather in the distance. Lights flickered across the valley as men roused from sleep. But it was Samuel who stood in the firelight, his tall figure unflinching against Crawford's mob. "Hardin." Crawford's voice roared from the dark. "Step aside. This ain't your fight. Let the widow face what she deserves." Samuel's voice thundered back. "If you want her, you'll have to come through me." The words hung in the air, sharp as steel. Crawford cursed, spurring his horse forward with two men behind him. Samuel's rifle cracked, the shot whistling past Crawford's hat. The horse reared, throwing Crawford to the dirt. The mob faltered, their courage shaking at the sight of their leader sprawled in the dust. And then something happened no one expected. Clara stepped forward, her children huddled behind her. Smoke smudged her face, her hair tangled, but her voice rang clear as a bell. "Crawford," she shouted. "You call me nothing, call me shame, but look at yourself. You burn homes, you terrorize children, you hide behind the darkness. You are the shame of Dry Creek, not me." The mob shifted uneasily. A few men lowered their guns. Clara's words struck harder than Samuel's bullets, for truth had a way of breaking chains faster than fear. Crawford staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You'll regret those words," he spat. Samuel stepped between him and Clara, his voice low but steady. "No, Crawford. You will." By then neighbors had come closer, drawn by fire and fury. Among them were men who had once feared Crawford, but seeing Samuel stand and Clara speak, something in them shifted. Courage is a wildfire and it spreads fast once sparked. "Enough, Crawford," one farmer called. "This ain't justice. This is madness." Another spoke. "You set a widow's home ablaze. You've gone too far." Soon the murmurs grew into a chorus. Crawford looked around, his supporters shrinking back, their loyalty crumbling in the face of shame. Alone he stood trembling, his power slipping like sand through fingers. Samuel lowered his rifle but didn't soften his voice. "Dry Creek won't follow you anymore. Leave this place. Tonight. Or face a reckoning you won't walk away from." Crawford looked at the crowd, then at Clara, her eyes fierce despite the smoke, and at Samuel, solid as the mountain behind them. He spat into the dirt, climbed onto his horse and with a last glare rode into the night. His men scattered like leaves in the wind, some ashamed, some relieved it was over. The fire was finally beaten back by neighbors with buckets and blankets, but Clara's cabin lay in ruins. Still, as dawn broke over the valley, something stronger than despair rose with it. For the first time Clara didn't feel alone. The town, silent too long, had finally spoken. And Samuel, standing beside her in the ash, had proven more than words could. As the sun touched the land, Matthew tugged at Clara's skirt. "Mama," he whispered, "does this mean we don't have to be afraid anymore?" Clara knelt, pulling him and Sarah close. Her eyes, though red from smoke, glowed with quiet strength. "It means we faced fear and we're still standing. That's what matters." Samuel, watching her with the children, felt a warmth settle in his chest. A promise, unspoken but certain. The storm had passed, but the bond forged in fire would remain. And so, in the ashes of loss, dignity and courage rose brighter than ever. The fire had stolen Clara's cabin, but it hadn't stolen her spirit. By the next morning, when the smoke had thinned and the land lay quiet again, she stood in the ashes with Matthew on one side and Sarah on the other. Her dress was smudged, her hair undone, but her back was straight, her eyes unbroken. Samuel rode up slowly, dismounting beside her. He had been awake all night, helping neighbors beat back the fire, checking on her children, making sure no embers crept to the fields. His coat was dusted with ash, his hands raw, but his gaze was steady. Clara turned to him, her voice low, almost weary. "There's nothing left, Samuel. Not even the bed where my babies laid their heads." He looked at her, then at the children clutching her skirts. "Things can be built again. Walls, roofs, fences, those are easy. What matters is standing. You stood. That's more than Crawford ever managed." Clara's lips trembled. She wanted to argue, to say she felt hollow, but the truth was she did feel a strange strength beneath the sorrow. She had faced fear in its rawest form and hadn't bowed. Neighbors gathered as the morning wore on. They brought bread, blankets, and soft words. A few men with tools offered to help rebuild. For the first time in years, Clara felt the town's eyes on her not with scorn but with respect. It wasn't pity, they had seen her stand too strong for that. Samuel stayed close through it all, quiet but present. When the sun climbed higher he finally spoke. Clara, you and the children can't stay here, not while it's just ashes. Come to the ranch. Stay until we can build again. Her pride bristled, the old reflex of a woman too used to bearing life alone. But she saw Matthew's tired eyes, Sarah's trembling hands, and she knew this wasn't just about pride. It was about giving them safety, even if it meant leaning on someone else. She nodded. Just until the house is raised again. Samuel's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. Just until then. At the ranch things felt different. Matthew roamed the wide pastures with wonder, chasing after calves and peppering Samuel's men with questions about saddles and ropes. Sarah followed the cook in the kitchen, helping roll biscuits with her tiny hands. And Clara, though uneasy at first, found herself slowly breathing easier in the wide rooms and warm firelight. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep in borrowed beds, Clara sat on the porch with Samuel. The crickets sang and the stars stretched endless above them. For a long while neither spoke. Finally, Clara broke the silence. You've given us more than I could repay, Samuel. My children, her voice caught, then steadied, they laugh again because of you. Samuel looked at her, his voice low. I didn't do it for repayment. Clara, when Crawford tried to tear you down you stood. You reminded me what real strength looks like. For years I thought money, land, cattle, that's what made a man strong. But watching you, I learned better. Clara's throat tightened. And yet, if not for you, I'd have lost everything. You never lost yourself, he said softly. That's the part Crawford could never touch. And that's why he stopped, swallowing hard, the words caught in his chest. That's why I'll stand beside you as long as you'll let me. Clara's eyes shimmered, catching the starlight. She hadn't expected such words, not from a man like Samuel Hardin, known across the valley as iron-willed, untouchable. But there he was, speaking not like a rancher guarding land, but like a man laying bare his heart. She turned her gaze back to the sky, her hands folding in her lap. I don't know what the future holds, Samuel. I've lived too long with sorrow to trust in promises. But, her voice softened. I know I don't want to walk it alone anymore. Samuel didn't reach for her hand, didn't press for more. He only nodded as if that was all he needed, for now. The weeks passed and the ranch grew alive with new purpose. Men from town came to help raise the frame of Clara's new cabin. Women brought pies and quilts, whispering that maybe they had been too quick to judge the widow before. The children ran in the meadow, their laughter carrying further each day. And slowly, gently, a bond grew between Samuel and Clara, not rushed, not spoken in grand declarations but in small, steady moments. He showed Matthew how to ride a horse, she mended Samuel's torn shirts by lamplight. He read Sarah a story by the fire, she made sure his supper plate was never left empty. It was in these quiet acts that love grew, unspoken but undeniable. One crisp morning, as the first frost touched the grass, Clara walked with Samuel out to the half-built cabin. The walls were rising now, the roof soon to follow. She touched the beams with her hand, her eyes full of wonder. I never thought I'd see it rebuilt, she whispered. You'll see more than that, Samuel said, his voice sure. You'll see a home stronger than before. One that no fire, no man can take from you. She looked at him, then truly looked. Samuel, why have you done all this for me? For us. His answer was simple, his tone steady as the land itself. Because your fight became mine the moment I saw you stand in that churchyard. And because Clara, he paused, the word heavy on his tongue. Because I love you. The world seemed to still. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching. No man had spoken those words to her since her husband passed, and never with such depth. She searched Samuel's eyes and found no doubt there, no pity, no pride. Just truth. Tears welled, but they weren't of sorrow. Samuel, I never thought I'd hear those words again. And I never thought my heart could answer. But it does. It does. For the first time, Samuel reached for her hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, firm, steady, unshakable. In that simple touch, more was said than any words could carry. From that day on, life in Dry Creek slowly changed. Crawford never returned, his name spoken less and less until it vanished like smoke. The town remembered instead the night the widow stood in fire and the rich rancher stood beside her. And Clara, once whispered about in pity, walked with her head high, her children safe at her side, her dignity not just restored but shining. The cabin was finished before winter's deep bite. On the day Clara and her children moved back in, Samuel was there, carrying the first box through the door. He set it down, then paused, his eyes roaming the small, sturdy home. "It's more than walls," he said quietly. "It's a beginning." Clara smiled, her heart full. She knew what he meant. For her children, and for him. A beginning built not on pity or wealth, but on courage, respect, and love. And so, in Dry Creek, where gossip once carried only cruelty, a new story took root. The story of a widow who would not bend, of a rancher who learned the measure of true strength, and of two hearts that found each other not in comfort but in fire. Years passed, and the memory of that fire on the widow's land faded into something deeper. A story folks told by lamplight, a tale of courage and love. Dry Creek changed with the seasons, but the mark of that night and what followed never left its soil. Clara's cabin, once nothing but ashes, stood tall and sturdy now. Its beams were stronger than before, its windows clear, its hearth warm. But more than wood and nails, it held laughter, love, and the kind of peace only hard-won dignity can bring. Matthew grew into a tall young man, broad in the shoulders, steady in his word. He worked Samuel's ranch with a hunger to learn, and soon he rode like a cowboy born in the saddle. Men in town would nod at him, saying he had his mother's grit and Samuel's quiet strength. Sarah blossomed too, her smile softening even the hardest days. She helped her mother, baked pies for church gatherings, and sang hymns that made the whole congregation still their voices just to hear her. And through it all, Samuel was there. He never pressed Clara, never demanded more than she was ready to give. But love, like a river, carved its own path, slow and steady. One spring morning, with the wildflowers blooming on the hill and the whole town gathered, Clara Hardin became more than just the widow. She became Samuel's wife. It wasn't a grand wedding, just a circle of neighbors, children in clean clothes, and a preacher with a worn Bible. Yet when Samuel took Clara's hand and spoke his vows, there wasn't a dry eye in Dry Creek. For every person there knew what it meant. This wasn't about wealth or land. It was about two souls who had faced fire, shame, and fear, and come out stronger together. Clara wore a simple white dress sewn by women who once whispered about her, but now whispered blessings. Matthew stood tall beside Samuel, proud as any son, and Sarah clutched a bouquet of daisies, grinning as wide as the horizon. When Samuel kissed Clara beneath the open sky, it wasn't just the start of a marriage. It was a promise to the land itself, that what had once been broken could be whole again. The years rolled forward. The ranch grew, the valley flourished, and Samuel's name became not just one of wealth, but of honor. He was no longer spoken of as the rich rancher, but as the man who stood when it counted, the man who chose dignity over pride and love over silence. Clara became the quiet heart of the community. Women came to her for advice, for comfort, for strength. She never spoke of herself as a leader, but she led by the way she lived. Her children thrived not just because of Samuel's roof, but because of the courage their mother showed when she had nothing. And Crawford? His name faded like dust in the wind. Some said he died in another town, drunk and bitter. Others claimed he drifted further west, chasing trouble until it caught him. But in Dry Creek, no one cared to keep his memory alive. His cruelty had burned fast and empty, while Clara's dignity burned slow and eternal. As the years passed, stories grew around the fire. Old-timers would lean back in their chairs, their voices carrying to the younger ones. "You should have seen it," they'd say. That night, when the widow stood in front of Crawford's men, with fire behind her and her children at her side. She didn't bow. She didn't beg. She faced him with nothing but truth in her voice. And Samuel Hardin? He stood right there with her, rifle in hand, daring Crawford to move an inch closer. That's the kind of strength that built this town. Children would listen wide-eyed, the tale sinking into their bones. To them it wasn't just a story. It was a lesson, that dignity cannot be bought, that courage can live in the poorest cabin, and that true love grows strongest in fire. Clara and Samuel grew old together. Their hair silvered, their steps slowed, but their bond only deepened. Samuel often said he had been a rich man long before he married Clara, but only after did he understand what wealth truly was. On warm evenings they would sit on the porch of the cabin that had once been ash, their hands entwined, their children grown and their grandchildren playing in the yard. And Clara would smile, knowing that the shadows of the past no longer held her, that her name, once whispered in pity, was now spoken with honor. One autumn, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew sharp, Samuel sat with Clara by the fire. His voice, softer now with age, carried the same steady truth it always had. "Clara," he said, "I pretended to sleep once just to test what was true. But in all the years since, I've never doubted what I saw in you that day. Your strength, your dignity, your heart, that's what saved me. Not the other way around." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "And I thought I was the one rescued. Funny, isn't it, how we both found what we needed in each other?" He kissed her hand, and in that simple act lay a lifetime of love, of trials faced and victories won. When at last, years later, their time on earth came to its end, the town mourned deeply. But they didn't speak of loss. They spoke of legacy. Of a widow who wouldn't bow. Of a rancher who learned what real wealth was. Of a love that grew out of ashes and lit the way for others. And so, in Dry Creek, the story lived on. Passed from porch to porch, pew to pew, heart to heart. A reminder that courage can rise from sorrow, that dignity shines brightest in the dark, and that love, once found, can turn even the harshest land into home.